Today is June 24, 2017, and we'll be continuing our study of the community rule tonight. As always, let's ask our Heavenly Family to guide us. Our wonderful Heavenly Family, thank you so much for this wonderful day. Thank you for not leaving this world to darkness, not leaving us to chaos, but bringing in order and bringing in light. Thank you for fighting on our behalf. We know that the primary battle is one of ideology, and we want to have correct thinking. Please help us, rid us of all of our misconceptions, and bring us to an accurate understanding of reality, and help us to grow in knowledge and in love. Thank you so much. Please help us to understand the community rule for what it is, and bring this to be the best meeting it could possibly be. Thank you so much. We ask this, Father and Mother, B'Shem Tzemach. Amen.
Amen.
And of course, B'Shem Tzemach means in the name of branch. Always good to translate.
Mm-hmm.
So, I really enjoyed last night's community rule discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Getting to the principles underlying various statements and various elements of truth is so important. And so it was really cool to do that. We'll still be following our regular pattern for the community rule studies. But of course, as I've mentioned on several other occasions, if we end up spending most of the time in step 2 and don't get to step 3 in a community rule study such as tonight, that's perfectly fine. And last night, of course, I mentioned that if anyone else had further questions or comments on what we were discussing then we could continue on with that tonight. But we'll still start with recapping what the community rule is, why it's important, and our methods of investigating it, and then go from there into comments and questions broadly related to the community rule. And then if we end up having time after that, then we'll get into a line-by-line investigation, picking up where we left off. So first, I'll actually ask you guys this time, what essentially is the community rule? And anyone can feel free to answer.
The community rule is a it's kind of like the Constitution and bylaws for the Qumran community. It's kind of a guidebook to their belief system and their way of living, and they get into a little bit of rules and a little bit of how to deal with conduct and so on. But mostly it's just the structure of their community, how they're going to have their systems set up and that kind of thing.
Excellent. Yes, absolutely. Does anyone have anything to add to that?
I guess I don't know if it's really adding to it, but to say that it's really the only logical way that a group of people could live eternally together. Like there's only unending goodness and unending truth, and falsehood has to be eradicated, and so it's a system for doing that. And if that doesn't happen, then there can't be an unending eternal life.
Okay, excellent comment. Yeah, I actually, the times when we do this where I'll kind of ask you guys to explain what it is and why it's important and our methods and all of that, I really enjoy it because, just hearing other people explain and kind of bringing out points that stand out to them is really cool. And the other thing is, it's a really good opportunity for all of you guys, because in sharing things or in explaining things, it helps you to formulate the ideas more clearly in your own mind and to simply understand it better. And so that's pretty cool. Does anyone else have anything to add to the description? We'll start first just with what the community rule is, and then after I'll ask why it's important, and then get into the methods and everything. But does anyone have anything else, kind of basic or whatever, to add in terms of what the community rule is? And you're not expected to say anything new. You can say the same things that we've talked about however many times, but just imagine, if someone listens to this later, what might they want to know about the community rule in identifying really what it is?
Well, it's an ancient document that was discovered in the caves of Qumran. I believe they say it was written around 200 years before the time of Christ. And it's also been, there's parts of it that were referred to, like we might say, well, somebody quoted it, or it sounded something Christ and also the disciples would speak about something, and it would sound very much like something from the community rule back in those days. So that's one thing. It's also a place where many feel that John the Baptist may have visited or even possibly lived. And not necessarily everyone who followed those teachings actually lived there. Some lived there in a smaller community, and then I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there were others, in the surrounding area that also were believers of that way of life. And that way of life, by the way, was, light versus darkness. The teachings were all about the way, which is the same terminology that Christ used many times in his teachings. So that's really all I could think of right now. But yeah, light versus dark, the right way versus the wrong way, righteousness, becoming righteous, and learning more and more as time passes, progressing upwards. I guess that's all.
Okay. I'll just mention, strangely, we missed part of that. Our phone didn't cut out in a usual way, but in an unusual way it kind of did, because it's like we got kicked out of the call, basically. Like, we were still on, like, for us to call in, we have to go through a calling card. So we had called in through the calling card, and then through that system we call in to free conference call. So it's like we got bumped out of free conference call, but we're still in the calling card, and so we had to dial back in to free conference call,
which was very, very quick. We didn't miss much.
Yeah, we really didn't. But
well, I hope I didn't
wanted to mention.
Yeah, I may have made a mistake someplace. Did everybody else hear me? Did it sound right?
Sounded right to me.
Yeah, I'm not sure what part you missed, but...
Well, we heard you say that most of the beginning, about halfway through we missed a few seconds, maybe 20, 30 seconds, but you were mentioning how Jesus and his followers quoted from and used ideas from the community rule, and that's right where you cut out.
Actually, she just started to mention something about John the Baptist, and now some say John.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all.
Right then,
yeah, some people say, that he visited or even possibly lived there, and
right.
And that may have been the time when I also mentioned that not all the believers of those teachings necessarily lived in that smaller community, that there were people in the surrounding area that were also believers, is the way I'm understanding it from what history tells us. And I don't really know what else. And then did you hear the part, that it was, I think the main thing that comes across to me in the community rule, or at least one of the main points, is the teaching of light versus darkness, the way, and Jesus used that terminology, the right way versus wrong way, and seeking righteousness and progressing. So.
Yeah, we heard that part for sure. But I'm glad that you repeated, especially the element of pointing out that, it wasn't just the people who lived at the Qumran settlement who believed in this particular way. There were actually others, but that was more like a headquarters of it sort of thing. I think that's a good point to make, certainly, and important to keep in mind. Yeah, that's pretty good. And so I'll just ask if anyone else has anything to add in terms of what it is, and if not, feel free to mention why the community rule is important.
Yeah, I have a comment.
Sure.
So the community rule is a set of writings written by the sectarian group, and it's a part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they were found in the 1st and 2nd century BCE in the caves of Qumran. And Qumran is a place which is located northwest of the Dead Sea in Israel, and I think so they were found in Cave 11, which happened to have the best preserved scrolls. And what I'm understanding is that the community rule is a document which lays out the principles and beliefs, practices, and organizational structure and mission. And the community rules gives a very important understanding of the Jews and the early followers of Christ.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, there was a lot of good points. Like one of the things that you mentioned, of course, is that it was part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's a really important aspect of identifying what the community rule is. At one point, there was a button that beeped when you said something, and I wasn't entirely sure what you said.
Which cave it was found in.
Yeah, which cave it was found in. So I'm not sure if you said it was found in a particular cave, like Cave 7 or Cave 11 or something like that. But maybe I'll just mention that, so the Dead Sea Scrolls in total, they were not all found in any one cave.
Or she was just referring to the community rule.
Yeah, it could be that you're just referring to the community rule. But I'll just mention anyway that broadly speaking, there's, for a long time people thought there were 11 caves until actually earlier this year it was discovered that there actually was another cave, Cave 12, and that there may be more. So now it's kind of more accurate to say 12 or more caves that contained Dead Sea Scrolls. And the first cave that they got scrolls from, they called Cave 1. And then the second cave, they called Cave 2. And then as they found more caves with scrolls, they would just name it by the next number. So the two caves that actually had copies of the community rule were Caves 1 and Caves 4. And I'm not sure. I'd have to check again. There might be one part, like one very small fragment from Cave 5. I'd have to double check on that. The only ones that I know for certain are Caves 1 and Cave 4. And the one that is the best preserved copy, known as 1QS, was found in Cave 1. So I don't know if that actually was clarifying a point that you mentioned, Celia, just because I wasn't able to hear you well enough. So if you want to clarify that, that's fine.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll correct that then.
Okay, cool.
And then the other thing that we noticed, and again, it may have just even been that you read the notes wrong, potentially, I'm not sure, but the documents of the Dead Sea Scrolls weren't found in the 1st or 2nd century BCE. That's when some of them were written. The Qumran community, the settlement there, was founded. It began its existence at that location around the 1st or 2nd century BCE. Around maybe 150, 160, something like that, right?
Yeah.
BCE. So that's when some of the documents, the sectarian documents, and I was really impressed that you brought that out, the sectarian literature and everything. There were certain documents written by the scribal community at Qumran that originated with them, and that's what Trent's been referring to as sectarian writings. But they also had other scrolls from prior to their day that they just had preserved and copied, the people had preserved and copied over the years, and that they still maintained. So the sectarian writings originated at their commencement of the community. But they were discovered, a couple different times, but the most popular, most commonly known discovery was in the 1940s.
Yeah. So written back in the 2nd century, 1st century BCE, some in the 1st century of the Common Era, like overlapping into the days of Jesus, but found from 1946 to 1956. So I know I was just reiterating what Teresa said, but
with more clarity.
Yeah, to just summarize a little bit of it.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. So does anyone else have anything to add?
Yes.
Go for it.
I was just thinking it's a sandlot illustration of God's will being done on earth. Something like that.
A what illustration?
Sandlot.
Sandlot.
Okay, I'm not really familiar with the term, actually.
Yeah, I was going to ask him what that meant because I'm not familiar either. Thank you.
The likeness, God's will. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Okay, the sandlot part is the part that I don't understand really, but I get the basic point that you're making, that the community rule, talks about or illustrates what it's like to have heaven and earth joined and the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. I totally get your main point. So maybe even the whole sandlot aspect isn't, that vital to what you're saying. But I just wanted to let you know that I'm not familiar with the expression, and so, yeah.
Just an illustration then, maybe.
Okay, sure. That's a good point to bring out, because that's one of the really interesting things about the Qumran community, is that they had this emphasis on the uniting of the children with the children of heaven. And so the community rule definitely has that element within it. So, yeah, really cool. I don't know if there was anything further that you wanted to say to expand that or anything. But if not, that's fine. Does anyone else have anything to add, either to what it is or why it's important? Okay, perhaps not. Would anyone like to explain our methods of studying the community rule?
Try to study it from the author's point of view.
Excellent, absolutely.
Does it claim divine origin?
Excellent. Yeah, that's a question that we certainly ask when studying any of these ancient writings, because that, of course, greatly influences our expectations of what is supposed to be. Anything else?
And what is its moral claims?
Good, absolutely. Another important question to ask.
And based on the true reality, material, not spiritualism, and heavenly family principles, are they lining up with the principles and the prophets that we've been studying?
Yeah, we definitely want to know if it lines up with the principles that we've learned in the message and all of that sort of thing.
And the whole aspect of corresponding to reality and truth and materialism, excellent points of how we go about investigating.
Absolutely. Anything else?
We investigate their unique claims, and also, I think you had a word for it, but when we look at a writing from the context of the time period it was written, in other words, we're so far after it. Obviously we have the Book of Revelation. They didn't, so we don't want to import any of those ideas or let that jade our evaluation of what they were writing, what time period, and what information that they had at that time.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. The word that you might be thinking of is anachronism, which is just taking something from a later time and applying it to an earlier time to which it does not belong. But yeah, this is such an extremely important aspect of how we need to go about studying it, because that's the only way to really understand it for itself, rather than, understanding some conceptual idea of it that doesn't actually match the reality of it. So yeah, that's very important.
That's the word, thanks. I wrote it down.
Cool. Does anyone else want to add anything?
And vocabularies, different time period, like the word creation, what it means, and compared to different text translation, different authors.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we have to keep in mind that the way that they use terms wasn't necessarily the same way that we use terms, and checking it with other writings or even other translations of the text itself. But yeah, all of what you said is definitely an important part of the investigation.
Basically, also, we should investigate it, asking about its historicity, right? That way it would help us form questions and figure out what questions to ask even.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I want to kind of expand for a moment to go a little bit beyond the community rule just on the principle, and examining the historicity of particular claims is really important. In regard to the community rule, that's kind of interesting because it's not intending to explain a history. Like, it's not telling of the past from the perspective of the author. It's more so giving guidelines and so on in regard to the present and the future from the time it was written. So examining the historicity, I don't know exactly how that would apply in terms of the community rule, other than studying the history of the text and the history of the community represented by the text, which in order to do so, we'd have to bring in other texts and everything, which is all good, of course. We need to do that in order to fully understand it. And, whatever elements of the things mentioned in the community rule that may have historical application, and what I mean by that is people living out the instructions. So, for example, I'll mention one thing that may have some proposed history in the community rule we could examine in terms of historicity, and that is in the judicial section, as I like to call it, of the community rule, which describes various penalties for certain infractions and so on. There's at least one scholar who, upon examining the different manuscripts of the community rule, noticed that in some places, in some manuscripts, it will give a penalty for a certain amount of days, and in other manuscripts, it'll give a different amount of days for the same thing. And so, based on that and other factors within the community rule, he proposes that the judicial section is not so much like authoritative prescriptive law. In other words, it's not prescribing this is what must be done in every circumstances. It's more of a description of past rulings. And so if that theory is correct, then that would be an element of proposed historical record within the community rule. In other words, it's saying, hey, this is what was done on this occasion and that occasion, and then we can examine those points for historicity. But to extend the principle of testing historicity beyond the community rule, this applies most directly when it comes to writings which are intended to convey information about a certain person or group of people at a certain time, or about certain events and so on. So, historical data, for instance, the Gospels in the New Testament, or the books of Kings and Chronicles and different things like that, they're telling a story. And so writings which tell a story, you can really examine them for historicity. In other words, you can examine to see how closely the picture presented in this particular text aligns with what actually happened in the past, as can be discerned by available present evidence. So that's something that is very important to do, and it's something that is often left out of the study of the Bible and of other ancient texts, other than, of course, among historians, because that's what they are at least supposed to do. But most believers don't study writings like this, asking questions about historicity. Did it happen? Because it's assumed that it did. But we're learning that we definitely have to ask those questions and ask them along with the other questions about morality and inspiration and so on. So I'm glad that you mentioned that element.
I have a comment or question.
Sure.
It may tie in a little bit with historicity, I'm not sure. Aren't we also, I think we've even talked about this, supposed to be open to the idea that maybe there, how do I want to put that? That maybe we'll find out that some of what we know as the community rule could have actually been written by somebody else, And, of course, I don't know how we're going to discover that on our own unless it's just revealed to us. But that would explain some of the things we don't understand yet. And on the other hand, maybe we just need more time to understand the things we don't understand. So, but, you know, in the first 5 books of the Bible, we've learned, hey, there's no way Moses could have written all of that because some of it took place after his time. And so that could possibly be the same situation here, that maybe we'll find out later that, well, maybe this part, everything we've studied so far seems to just be perfectly logical and be proven. So as we study along, is it possible that we might discover that maybe there were multiple writers or something was added at a later date that isn't really from the teacher of righteousness? Or could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. In regard to the point that you were raising, we do not know who the author or authors of the community rule are. We don't know if the teacher of righteousness wrote any of it yet. We do know that it at least contains some of the ideas that were unique and original to the teacher of righteousness, but we don't know if he authored any part of it. He may have, and maybe he authored all of it. It is possible to discover whether a document is composite or a unity, at least in many instances. Sometimes maybe it's not. You know, sometimes maybe it is a composite, but it's so well done that it's impossible to tell. But this is one of the things that historians do study when they're looking at all of these ancient texts. And there are definitely methods that can be validly used in order to study whether a document is composite or not. And one of the ways to do that is studying textual criticism, which is essentially looking at all of the manuscripts available of a given writing, a certain composition, and comparing them in order to identify the history of the wording of the text. And so you might be able to notice, like especially if you have a lot of manuscripts on something, you might be able to find that, okay, well, for the first 500 years, the manuscripts that we have within the first 500 years of a certain text all have something worded like this. And then after that, you start seeing texts emerge which have a slightly different wording on this. Well, that is pretty much showing you that most likely the original wording is what it is in all the manuscripts from the first 500 years, because the other wording emerged later. Or for a real example, in the Gospel of John, there is the story of the woman caught in adultery, which is mostly in John chapter 8, and in none of the earliest and best copies of the Gospel of John is that story there. In fact, in the best manuscripts and the earliest manuscripts, it goes from the verse right before that story to the verse right after, and it flows perfectly fine. And so it lets you know that that section was not originally part of the Gospel of John. And so, in a sense, John has an element of a composite nature because there have been certain things added to it. But, you know, as a whole, just that element doesn't say that as a whole it's a composite, but it has somewhat of a composite nature because of additions. But then that still wouldn't tell you who wrote that section, because it's possible that the same author could write a second edition of their same text and include extra information. So one might say, well, it seems likely that even though this wasn't originally part of the Gospel of John, the same author wrote it and then included it in kind of a second edition of their writing. But in this particular instance, that is actually very unlikely. And the reason why is because it's not like it suddenly shows up and it's in this place. No, that particular story of the woman caught in adultery, in the manuscripts of the Gospel of John, in the earliest ones, it's not there at all. And then when it starts to appear, it's stuck in different places in the Gospel of John. So it doesn't appear that the author just, okay, I'm coming out with a second edition and I'm including this story in this particular location, because that wouldn't account for why it kind of floats around in the text of the Gospel of John. And what is even more telling is the fact that it even shows up in a copy of the Gospel of Luke. And so, it's only later that it kind of stabilizes and finds its place in the Gospel of John. But for a while in the manuscript history, it floats around, and it's even in the Gospel. And then there's other testimony from church fathers that story was actually found in other writings, like the Gospel according to the Hebrews, for instance. And so that particular story that we now have in the Gospel of John was not originally in it, and appears to have originally been in something other than a writing of whoever wrote John. So, that's just an example to say that there are definitely times when you can tell that something is written by other authors, or at least wasn't in the original edition of a certain text. And, so that's one example. Another example is the one that you already gave of the Pentateuch. And for that, it's not that we know that there was multiple authors because of a textual history based off of manuscripts. That would be great, but the fact is that we don't have early enough manuscripts to really test the documentary hypothesis using a manuscript test. There are other tests. It's not like it's not testable. But the evidence for the documentary hypothesis isn't based on different manuscripts of the Pentateuch. It's based on what is referred to as internal evidence. And so, you have the different stories, you have the different names, you have awkward splicing, you have linguistic evidence, and there's a whole lot in terms of different lines of evidence. And in fact, Richard Elliott Friedman, in his book, The Bible with Sources Revealed, devotes the first 32 pages of his book to laying out the most concise explanation of the evidence for the documentary hypothesis, of which I'm aware, at least. And he lays out 7 different lines of evidence in favor of the hypothesis. And there's a lot, even without any manuscript evidence. So that's just another example. And then I'm going to give one other brief example that actually does have manuscript evidence for it, and that comes from Samuel, the story of David and Goliath. When we read it in the King James or in any translation which is based off of the Masoretic text, which most English translations of the Bible are, there's some weird conflict in the story of David and Goliath. Like, there's things where David is when you read it as we now have it, David is summoned to play music for Saul. And so he knows Saul, and he, is in the very close presence of Saul a lot for a while. And then the Philistines start to attack and become a threat and all of that. And so they go and they're challenged to find someone among them to battle against Goliath. And so David comes forward, and the strange thing is that Saul all of a sudden doesn't know who he is. And he has to be introduced to him as if for the first time. He totally just doesn't even know who this David guy, this son of Jesse, is. And so his armor bearer has to introduce them and all of that. And it's really awkward reading it in the Pentateuch, or sorry, not in the Pentateuch, reading it in Samuel as we have it today. And so that itself is evidence that, well, maybe this is a combination of originally independent stories. One where you had David and he meets Saul through this music experience, and then another one where he meets him through this military experience. And there are other differences, but that's kind of, a memorable one. Well, here's the thing. In this instance, we actually do have manuscript evidence, and dare I say proof, that this was originally two separate stories. Because in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of this particular text, you only have one line of stories. So it's actually way shorter. The story is way shorter in the Septuagint, and everything that's in the Septuagint is in the Masoretic text, but the Masoretic text also has a bunch of stuff that's not in the Septuagint. And when you read the Septuagint version on its own, it makes way more sense. And then if you take all those paragraphs and large sections that are in the Masoretic text but not in the Septuagint, and you read them on their own, subtracting all the stuff that's in the Septuagint, it makes sense on its own as an independent narrative. And so that is manuscript evidence showing that these were originally separate literary compositions, and by virtue of the fact that they have contradictory elements in the details of the story, indicates that it was most likely written by a different author, because the same author most likely would not end up writing something which gives a conflicting history. And even more importantly is if there's a difference in ideology or perspective. And if there's a difference in language too. I mean, all of those things add up, because you could have an author who changes their mind on something or writes something that's a different perspective, even the next year or the next month or whatever it may be. But if all the writing style is different as well, then it becomes less likely. So there's a lot of different components that are involved. But you can show that they were originally two separate literary compositions and were then spliced together in much the same way as the Pentateuch was. But this is actually a great example if anyone has a hard time thinking that this could possibly happen with the Pentateuch. Well, the fact is we know it happened with Samuel because we have the manuscript evidence. And so it's not far-fetched to say that this could have happened with the Pentateuch. And the way in which the two different stories are discernible in Samuel is the same way in which they are discernible in the Pentateuch. So with the community rule, we can apply those same methods. We can study the manuscripts, and we can study where there might seem to be an unnatural break or even a natural break in the community rule, and find out, does one section express a different ideology from a different section? Do they have different terminology? that isn't just due to dealing with different subjects? Do they express a development of a different stage of the Hebrew language? Those are all different questions that can be asked. And ultimately, through studying the text with those methods, we should be able to discover whether there's any evidence for multiple authors. So, yeah.
Is it okay if I make a comment?
Yeah.
As I'm listening to all this, I just started to formulate some thoughts. This portion of the discussion started with kind of Mom voicing how would we even know if this was written by more than one person or not? Seems like we wouldn't be able to know unless it was revealed by inspiration. And I can totally relate to that. I think the explanation that you've given is quite obvious and clear. I don't think there's any confusion with that at all. But I'm just now going back to kind of the progression of thought and kind of a realization in my own mind of kind of how I've thought in the past, maybe having remnants of that still, and just whatever, right? So, okay. So the thought, and the reason I'm hesitating is because it's so new, it's still formulating in my mind, but one of the aspects I think I want to mention before I go any further is how balance that we always have to have. And there's something very, very positive, of course, about a respect for how inspiration works and a respect for divinely revealed truth and not privately interpreting and that sort of thing. So it can be really easy, speaking from personal experience, I can see how easy it is to think, well, man, that would be impossible to just discover on my own. And so my initial reaction is, because I can't think of a way to discover it, well, then there must not be one. And maybe I would even think there isn't one, right? So rather than thinking, well, maybe I just don't understand how to go about discovering it. Being open without it being pointed out to me, my natural thought being, how can I find the answer? And I can see our Heavenly Family repeatedly helping us with that principle. And I think it's important that we recognize that, but at the same time, I can also see the flip side of then thinking we can figure everything out for ourselves. And I think it's important for us to recognize the distinction between privately interpreting something and seeking knowledge. And I know I would benefit from even better understanding of those two elements. So anyway, I don't know, maybe I have more to say, but if you have something you want to say now, that'd be good.
Well, sure. I mean, what you just said is, that you would like to better understand those elements and everything. And I could expand on it more. The difference between what can be discovered by an individual and what cannot be discovered by an individual, even, with or without inspiration, that sort of idea. So, Deuteronomy 29:29. The secret things belong to God.
Right.
And that which is open is for us and for our children forever.
you talked about this in principle last night, which is why I think my mind is more agitated on this still. But
yes, absolutely. And so, but it's such an important element. So here's the thing. The mysteries of God are things that cannot be discovered by anyone, even by a prophet. It's not like a prophet just like discovers it because a prophet's just so smart or something like that. No, the mysteries of God, the secrets of God, are only revealed by God. And yes, God reveals them through prophets. So to a prophet, and then tells the prophet to convey it to those who are ready. So, yeah, those things, no amount of searching and studying and all of that will be able to uncover those secrets of God without God revealing it. It's not like we can find out without our Heavenly Family wanting us to know. If they want to keep it a secret for now, they can keep it a secret for now. And no matter how hard we search, we will not be able to discover that secret until they want us to find out. That said, I would need to qualify that right away to say that we can hasten when they will reveal things.
I was going to say, if we're looking into it. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Like if we don't even show that we care to know, well, then maybe they won't show us. So we have to show that we care to know, and we have to diligently find the things that are already open for our discovery. If we don't care to find the things that are open for our discovery, well, why would they show us the things that are not? So we really need to study the things that are open. So, and, it's kind of like what we were talking about last night. It's not that we are unable to discover these things and unable to tell the difference between what is a secret of God and what is not. We can actually tell the difference. It's just we might be unaccustomed to that idea. But it's actually pretty straightforward. And historians do this all the time. In secular universities, at least in the United States, and actually this is more, or it is broader than the United States as well, but in secular universities, when they teach the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament or the Apocrypha and all these other texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they don't get into trying to explain mysteries of God. They don't get into religion. They're studying religion from an academic standpoint, but they don't teach religion. They don't teach spiritual ideas and so on. They examine it from an objective point of view as best as they are able, and they will get into the religious thoughts presented in texts in order to say, hey, by studying this, we have discerned that this is the theology of this particular individual. But they'll tell their students, like the professors will tell their students, it is not my place to examine whether that theology is correct. It's not my place to tell you what God thinks about it. It's not my place to tell you what you should think about it. But historians studying this text, we can tell you that Jesus believed in the authenticity of the Mosaic Law. Like, in studying all of the statements attributed to Jesus and finding which ones have historical evidence in favor of Jesus having actually said them, they are pro-law of Moses. That's a statement that a historian can make that does not require any interpretation of a religious perspective and doesn't require any sort of anything like that. Like, you can just study the evidence, and find that that is the case. So that's something that any of us can do. It's not about discovering the hidden meaning of texts and interpreting, prophecies and all of those sorts of things. That's not something that requires any sort of special divine inspiration. And so, like the things that I mentioned about the Pentateuch and about Samuel and all of that, that is stuff that was discovered by a critical study of the text by people who make a living as scholars and professors of the history of these texts. And so that obviously can be discovered without divine inspiration because it was discovered without divine inspiration. And so if you want to know the history of the community rule, if you want to know who wrote it, that's a question of history. It's not a question of the mysteries of God. And so this is something that's open for all of us. And the reason why we spend so much time examining questions like this is because our Heavenly Family has put it upon me to encourage you guys and to teach you guys how to study. When we get to a new moon, that's another subject. A good way to tell the difference is listen to our new moon studies and then listen to our community rule studies or our virgin birth studies or whatever and compare them and take note of the differences in how we approach the subject. That will help you to know, what is it that I can discover on my own? So, and I will qualify that to say sometimes in a new moon study, if I'm introducing a new text, I will go through some of the historical information about the text to give some sort of foundation. But then when it comes to interpreting the text, that's another story. So, all of these questions, it's that, we're not going through the community rule in such detail together because you guys need me in order to understand the things that we're talking about. No. We're doing this, I'm going through this in order to show you guys what you can discover on your own. Now, of course, I will say that make use of the divine guidance that you have in terms of principle. Our Heavenly Family is here to guide you. And when Teresa and I study things, even that are not dealing with a particular ancient text that's even claiming inspiration, like if we're studying the history of something or whatever, we still do ask our Heavenly Family for help to apply the principles rightly and to come to the correct conclusions and to use the right methods and to better understand the methods and all of that. So when I say to do it on your own, I mean to do it with the help of our Heavenly Family yourself. And again, even scholars who don't use these principles directly are able to do it. But I will say that they are successful really only insofar as they make use of these principles and apply them, because scholars don't always stay true to the principles of truth and proper investigation and so on. But they're supposed to, and they're supposed to be critical in their examination of things. And so, that's really it. These studies are intended to show you how you can study, and just try to pay attention to the sorts of questions that are being asked. And really, maybe it's a helpful thing to realize the sorts of questions you can successfully find answers to. So if you're studying something, and let's just to give like a really blatant example, let's say you're studying Revelation 10, and you want to know, oh man, it talks about the mystery of God here. I want to know the mystery of God. And so you start studying that. Well, you know what? you won't be able to find the mystery of God without inspiration. But what you can do is say, I'm going to study everything that I can in relation to this text. Who wrote Revelation? Revelation 10. What did it mean to its original author and to those who originally read it? Is that discoverable? The symbols that are used in Revelation 10, are these symbols that were known to the author and used elsewhere and are able to be discovered? And if so, then you can discover that. And so, that you can ask those sorts of questions. So asking mystery of God type questions, yes, you won't be able to discover the answer to that. But if you're asking the questions about history, if you're asking questions about what is the plain meaning of this text, if you're asking questions about, what did this author think on this particular subject that they're actually talking about? Well, you can find that sort of thing out without needing a prophet to tell you. And so that's one of the primary purposes of these studies, is to encourage you all to study all of these ancient writings in that way. And so, in a sense, you can learn a lot from modern biblical scholarship because they try to study without being too speculative and really. Here's the thing. This is the great thing about scholarship and academia and really just the professional study of anything, whether it's chemistry, biology, history, psychology, whatever it may be. Like when it actually comes to the professional academic study of these various topics, the great thing about it is that it is competitive in nature, not in the sense of, oh, I want to be the best this and I want to be the best that, but in the sense that you better have evidence for what you are going to say, because if you don't, your peers are going to point it out and discredit your theory, and then you won't go anywhere. And so it's a very serious thing when it comes to the professional study of these things, that people have to have evidence for what they're saying, because if they don't, they'll get shot out. If they do have evidence, then the way people will make a living is to come up with a new understanding that has evidence, or to build on an understanding, increasing the knowledge of it by means of new evidence that someone else didn't present, even if it's in agreement with their understanding. And people try to falsify other people's understandings. Like if someone presents something, well, people will do a bunch of tests to see, is that really correct? Because if and this is one thing, in academia, if you can overthrow a consensus position, then you've made a name for yourself. If you can show that the consensus is wrong, you've made a name for yourself. That's what every academic really wants to do. And so the common consensus is tested all the time. And this is so contrary from how people outside of academia often view it. Often people from outside have kind of a conspiratorial view of professionals, scientists or people at universities. Oh, they just want to promote their view of things, and anyone with an alternative view is shot down or not taken seriously or whatever. And maybe they won't be taken seriously, but maybe that's because they haven't actually meticulously presented their view. But people do meticulously present their views, and guess what? a lot of academics actually will take seriously the theories of people who are not themselves academics and don't have degrees. But you have to submit it to the peer review process. And so the peer review process is a wonderful thing. It's testing and testing again and testing again. It's the process of experimentation. And so, that's why I'm saying we can learn a lot from modern biblical scholarship, even though, I will say that in many ways we do have an advantage because we have the principles laid out for us more clearly than they do for them. And so we're able to do the work that they do if so long as we've really taken these principles of the message, we can actually do the work that they do and advance it more quickly and even come to conclusions that they might not be able to come to because we have a larger tool set and we have a more refined tool set. And, sometimes, as I become acquainted more and more with what modern biblical scholarship has to say on certain things, I'll find certain things where some scholars are saying certain ideas, or at least going in the direction of saying ideas that we've been saying in the message all along, even going back to previous phases of the message, but, they don't have it as formulated. They don't have it as complete because they don't have the principles that we have. And so we can say, oh, hey, actually, by the way, we've had this knowledge for however long, and we had this line of evidence in favor of it, and actually contribute to the broader understanding of everyone. But we need to get rid of the idea that scholars and professionals and people in universities just can't wait to, just keep their perspective safe. No, it's competitive. Anyone able to come and present a contrary theory to the consensus in any academic setting, that's how they will make a name for themselves. And that's what every academic wants to do. They aren't trying to maintain the consensus. No, they're actually trying to see if they can tear it down. And so it's just important to keep in mind, though the principles by which modern biblical scholars study are really the principles that they learned from the reformers. Well, really, of course, the contemporary, actual modern biblical scholars learned it from a previous generation of biblical scholars who learned it from a previous generation, who learned it from a previous generation, who learned it from the reformers. So the Protestant reformers started what developed into modern biblical scholarship. And so, it's studying things critically, and the reformers made a heavy emphasis on history and language and, a critical, more scientific study of these texts in order to discover what they say. And that's how we need to study it.
Amen.
One other thing I'll add. For our purposes, we can definitely take a step beyond what a biblical scholar should in a secular setting, because it is inappropriate in a university setting for a professor to then take the finds of scholarship and then apply it theologically. That would be inappropriate. To apply it in terms of morality and what this has to do about God, with God, and what God thinks on something, and all of that sort of thing. But in our setting, it is entirely appropriate and necessary for us to apply, and even with some things we're doing that, okay, let's test the documentary hypothesis, which is something that comes from the scholarly world. Let's see if it's true, and if so, well, what are the implications of that for beliefs? That's something that is out of bounds in a university setting. That's something that is in bounds here. And so, in an academic setting, they can't say, now include this in your devotional life. Here we can and should say, yes, contemplate this in your devotional life. Consider this more deeply in terms of your belief, and this point, allow it to strengthen you, and this is the conclusion in regard to this and that. And so I just wanted to say, just because I'm advocating studying using critical methods and asking historical questions, and hey, these are things that you can discover without a prophet telling you, I'm not saying to entirely model your approach off of like an academic setting. No, I'm just saying you can learn from that, but our approach goes so far beyond that. Does anyone have any comments or questions in regard to these things?
I will say that it's definitely helpful to have these reminders as to what can we know or learn, and what can't we, how to discern between the two, and what to do if we come to something that we recognize is in the category of what can only be discerned by revelation. Well, that doesn't mean, don't do anything, just sit back and wait until someone does reveal it, but to learn as much as we can about the surrounding text or time or whatever the case may be.
The surrounding aspects, even of the same text, yeah.
Yes. And so, very good reminder, and I'm just so grateful to our Heavenly Family that they are really educating us. They're not just, it's not even that they're, okay, there's two aspects here that I'm trying to convey, and I'm kind of getting them jumbled in my mind. So we'll see if I can at least get one of them out straight. We're being taught how to learn, but it's more than that. We're being taught how to learn about spiritual things, about what's in Scripture, prophecy, all of that. But we're also being taught, the main thing I think really that we're being taught are, we've talked about this many times too, the principles. And principles of truth are not theological. They apply to theology, but they apply to literally everything. And that's what I haven't understood in my life. Even if maybe, kind of innately I understood certain principles to a degree, it wasn't at a conscious enough level to be applied to life in general, and just life and learning. And what it does is it does encourage a lazy attitude, a lazy behavior. And out of fear, partly, I wouldn't be able to figure it out, so I'm not going to spend any energy trying to type thing. And so now I feel like our Heavenly Family has given us so much instruction on principles of truth and what truth is, and that's absolutely huge. Just understanding material reality and how, it's some very simple things, but so simple that you don't even recognize it a lot of times. How, well, what does it mean for something to be true? And people give all these explanations, ideas of what it means to be true. But it's so simple. Well, it corresponds to the physical reality. If you say, I have a sister, and you don't have a sister, that's not true. And the reason it's not true is because no one exists. That is not real. So these principles of learning and understanding what truth is and reality and all that, it helps in every aspect of life. And this, what I'm about to say next, is more of a wonderment and a question, because I haven't thought it through enough to know what I think about it for sure. But I'm wondering if, well, I don't know. Anyway, I'm wondering if we're going to find more and more and more that there's really just less distinction between quote-unquote spiritual things and non-spiritual things. The reason I ask that and wonder that is because, spiritual things just correspond to material reality like everything else. And we often, or I really am only speaking for myself here, I often still find myself, to even a slight degree, kind of distinguishing a little bit between the two. Now, I will have to say it's not anything like it used to be. Like, there's a big, big difference in my way of thinking. I don't think of kind of like physical and non-physical anymore at all. That's not even there, because everything is physical. But it's tied into the secular and religious idea.
Right. I'm glad that you said that, because here's the thing. Because what you said could be taken in many different ways, some of which are definitely not good. So, like, the problem is the word spiritual, because it's so ill-defined. Mm-hmm. Spiritual things and common things, well, there is a very real distinction between the sacred and the common, and we have to keep them distinct. In fact, it is so important to keep the sacred and the common distinct. There's a huge, very stark contrast between one and the other. There are things that are devoted to our heavenly family and solely for their purposes and all dealing with the work of the gospel. Right. And then there are other things. And so, like, even what we're doing right now is distinguishing between the sacred and the common. Well, even the day. The day is sacred. Today, the Sabbath. Yeah, oh yeah, exactly. So I wanted to make that point really clear in case anyone would hear this and think, oh, are they blurring the line between the sacred and the common and all of that? And it's like, no. We're actually drawing the line and pointing out, like, history and all of that is a common thing, and we can all find that out. It's not one of these sacred things. But what you're talking about, and that's why I said I'm glad that you said it at the end here, the secular religious divide. Yeah. That is not a true divide. We should not think of things in terms of secular and religious. That is an inconsistent perspective on the world or I'll say, which, if held, does not help anyone to learn anything. It doesn't help them at all or better them or better anyone else. Viewing things in terms of the religious and the secular is very artificial. There's no straight dividing line between the two. In terms of the way things actually are. Now, there is a place for dividing between the secular and the religious, and that's when it comes to government, where it's definitely a positive thing to make that division because of the need to not have a government enforce any religious perspective or anti-religious perspective, because it leads to oppression.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a place where that idea in that setting makes sense. But the idea that I'm talking about of a secular religious divide is actually different than that. Because even when you advocate the separation of church and state, you can do that and still recognize political elements within religious understandings, and you can recognize, it's important to recognize when there are religious elements in government things, but government and secular is not equated. Government,
right.
Secular is broader than government. Government should be secular in a setting like this, but it shouldn't.
And by a setting like this, you just mean a non-theocracy. Is that right?
Yes, I do mean a non-theocracy, but not every form of theocracy is good either. In fact, most forms of theocracy are actually really bad.
My thinking is still so narrow in a lot of ways, because I recognize I was just identifying the word theocracy as Yahweh and only Yahweh, right?
Right, exactly.
I'm still kind of thinking in a monotheistic way.
Right, just like how other people might think that theocracy means Allah and only Allah.
Yeah.
Right, So a theocratic government is, to most people in the world, when you say theocracy, they think of like Islamic countries, and they think of other countries that are oppressive because of domineering a religious point of view and a religious law that restricts liberty for those who do not share that perspective. And so theocracy, as it is outplayed in most of Earth's history and in most settings, is actually an awful thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why it's a difficult subject to address, and why advocating a theocratic form of government requires explanation, because it may come across as absolutely anti-religious liberty when it's not, in the setting in which we are talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So
I just find so much humor in the realization about my thinking just now.
Okay.
Oh,
yeah.
Hilarious. I mean, so glad to have realized it, but
right.
It's like, man, how many things do we have like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure I'll find something else out about my way of thinking.
Sure, absolutely. we all constantly are, hopefully at least. So, government is one thing. Secular is another. Secular is just, whatever, non-religious in a specific sense. Government, obviously, is a totally other thing. It's talking about ruling a nation and doing all the things that a government is supposed to do. And so many governments are not secular, but now more and more governments are becoming secular. So a separation between government and religion is positive in almost every single setting. And then a separation between secular and religious, when I'm saying that that's an artificial divide, I'm saying that from the perspective of most people who have that divide. So most people who have that divide, in fact, I'll say everyone who has that divide is either secular or religious.
Mm.
And those who are religious and who have this whole, there's the secular thing and there's the religious thing, typically view the religious thing as good and the secular thing as bad. And most of those who are secular typically view the secular thing as good and the religious thing as bad. So that's the divide that I'm saying is artificial. Things are not good or bad based on their degree of religiosity or secularness, if that's the right word, if that is a word.
Secularity.
Secularity.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. But, that's not a way to judge something's value, whether it is religious or secular. There are plenty of secular things that are a complete waste of time and that are worse than a waste of time. And there are plenty of religious things that are a complete waste of time and worse than a waste of time. There are religious things that are good, and there are secular things that are good. And so, as I mentioned before, in the ancient world, they didn't have the secular religious divide like we do today. And it's really important for us to recognize that and to maybe think, hey, maybe that's not the best way to divide the world. It's just not really all that helpful. So, one of the things, this is kind of expanding on something I said the other night. It is something for us to question whether it's even accurate to describe this, what we're doing, this whole branch thing, as a religion. Because what most people think of by the term religion is very different from what this is. Doubtless, though, it has elements that people wouldn't classify in any other way but religious. And so for that reason, at the present time, I don't see any need to distance ourselves from the word, but we have to recognize that what most people think of when they use the term religion or religious is very different and in some ways contrary to what we are about. And it is also far more narrow than what we are about. For most people, religion is a particular category of things in life and in the world. And then you have all these other categories. Well, the branch message is not about one particular category of life. It's about the entirety of life. So, in many ways, it's a philosophy, but philosophy isn't the right term for it necessarily either, because people distinguish between philosophy and religion, and philosophy and politics, and all of these other things. And often people think of philosophy as being theoretical, as opposed to practical. But this is also about practice. This isn't about just what we think about things. It's about what we do about things. Of course, rooted in what we think about things, but it's about action, And this is very political, like we're talking about a nation and all of that. So it's political, it's social, it's heading toward economic, it's philosophical, it's religious, it's, all of these elements. But even religious, the idea that conveys to most people is a faith-based system. But to most people, faith means, believing something without evidence. Oh, it's just the belief. It's just the faith. And so if people define religion as a faith-based thing, and the way that they define faith is actually something which we diametrically oppose, then to say, yes, this is our religion, kind of gives the wrong idea. And the other thing, of course, is that for most people, religion is intimately connected to the supernatural. It's the non-physical stuff. It's the immaterial, the spiritual realm, something which we diametrically oppose. And so for those reasons, the word religion and religious really don't convey the idea of who we are and what we are about well at all. And for that reason, it might be better to express it differently. And, in talking to people here locally, for instance, I always try to find good ways of expressing things, because people find us, and we're so unusual, and we do things differently. We have a different focus in life than most people, and how do we express it? So, like I used to say, when people ask about my wife and I, yeah, we're full-time ministers. Oh, so like you pastor a congregation somewhere? Well, no, not really. It's not like that. Like when you say that, if you say ministers or pastors, like people are thinking of like,
preacher.
A preacher at a church somewhere, and, basically just explaining things from a particular holy book and whatever. And they're thinking Sunday, they're thinking like all of these other things, and so it requires so much explanation, but it adds an element of confusion, because now you introduce something and then you have to explain how everything that word means to them doesn't apply to what you're talking about. So anyway, our phone's going to cut out soon, so I'll hang up, we'll call back, and then I'll finish explaining this. Okay, so we're back. So I was explaining the problems with the word religion or religious as it applies to us. And, of course, I'm talking about this in relationship to this whole secular-religious divide. I don't think the term secular properly applies to us either. But religion definitely falls far short. And so, there are so many aspects of what we are really all about that are not comprehended in the word religion as it's understood today. And so it really does not accurately convey things. And so when I'm talking to people, I constantly try to find better ways of expressing things so that when I talk to someone and they want to know who we are and what we are about, I can explain it in a simple, easily understood way, which is difficult to do when this is so different from what people have ever encountered. And so if I say we're ministers, it gives the wrong idea. If I say we are, definitely saying Christians would give the wrong idea. We're religious people, that will give the wrong idea for the reasons I just explained. So I don't know if it's perfect yet, but it really depends on the person you're talking to as well. Like, what will they understand from what you're saying? But one of the ways in which I've been expressing it lately is that we are most interested in the practical application of moral philosophy, truth-based, evidence-based morality.
Mm-hmm.
And then if they ask, like, oh, okay, like, is it a religious thing? Well, I have to explain, well, not in the way that you might imagine it, or if someone asks, oh, do you believe in Jesus and all of that? The answer to that is yes, absolutely. Do you believe in God? What do you mean by God? That's a big question, because that's the other thing. If you say religion, then that automatically brings God to the question in most people's minds. But when they say God, they're imagining an immaterial, out of time, out of space being, if you can call it that. And it's a totally different thing. Like, people might think it's New Age. Like, even when they ask if it's religion, and I say, well, not really in the sense that you might normally think, then I've been asked, oh, is it like a New Age thing then? It's like, no, definitely not. Definitely not. And so, we have to search for better ways. I don't say that I have the best way of expressing things yet. But Heavenly Family, please show us the best way to approach this. But I thought that me bringing this up in terms of even our own identity and how we view things in terms of religion might be helpful in really communicating the fact that this whole divide between secular and religious, and the secular things are bad and the religious things are good, or something like that, as though those are accurate categories for evaluating value or morality or anything like that. Obviously it doesn't really work like that. And so I hope that me bringing this up highlights that, and I hope that it conveys it in a very clear way.
Excuse me, Trent.
Yeah.
Can you repeat again the first part of how you would explain it to someone? Truth-based. I just wanted to get the clarification of that again.
Sure. So the first part that I said was a practical application of moral philosophy, and particularly truth-based morality. And I said truth-based and evidence-based morality. And so, those are the types of ways that I would express it at this point. Or I would simply explain how we view selfishness as the biggest problem in the world, and we're interested in bringing an end to selfishness and in bringing about living according to the principles of love and doing things rightly, and that we understand that to be not an emotional thing or a sentimental thing, but a principle-based thing. And just, explaining how we believe that the only way to possibly do this is to do things based off of truth and evidence. But, words like evidence, I think, are very helpful in explaining what we're about to people, because if you say truth, well, someone might think, oh, so you mean your religious belief. If you say, it really depends who you're talking to. But still, there are kind of broad, general ways that are good to express things, and so that's what I'm trying to convey, that talking about evidence and talking about truth and about morality and bringing an end to suffering and selfishness, those sorts of things will be the best ways to accurately convey to people what we're really getting at.
Great.
And of course,
yeah.
material reality also, I'll add. Another element that I will mention is, in terms of the word religion and also the word religious, I mentioned, whether it was last night or recently, a scholar. He's actually a Jewish scholar by the name of Daniel Boyarin, and how he's examined the word religion, or actually I mentioned it in regard to the word Judaism, and how really there was no one Judaism, and how Judaism was about being a Jew, as distinct from being a Roman or an Athenian or something else. It wasn't describing a faith-based system. It was not a religious thing in anything like how we would use the term religion. But also, and I want to find Daniel Boyarin's writings on this and read them. I'm very interested to, and maybe some of you would be as well, to find out how he describes the history of religion, and how do you define exactly what religion is, and so on. And what there's some talks that he gives on YouTube as well. I've seen parts of some of them, and one of the things that he talked about, he was going through the history of the word religion, and how when it occurs in ancient Jewish texts, it's not describing anything like what we are talking about today, as in what comes to most people's minds when you use words like religion. The ancient, whether it's a Greek word or a Hebrew word that end up being translated as religion, and this isn't even in Jewish texts alone, it's also in other texts. Religion is not a system. It's not something as opposed to politics, philosophy, whatever. It's not a God-based theological thing necessarily, although mostly it is about a God, but it's not a belief-based, faith-based thing. To do religion is to do acts of devotion. So if you, it's like in James, pure and undefiled religion is this. And what does he say? Well, to,
care the widows and the orphans and feed the hungry. And
exactly. That's doing religion. And so that's kind of the idea of what religion really is in the ancient world. That's not what people think of today as religion. And in fact, to go with the definition in James, many organizations which we would consider secular do religion, because there are secular organizations who are secular humanist organizations which are devoted to human flourishing and who seek to relieve suffering and to help the poor and feed the hungry and clothe the naked and all of that. Under a common definition in the ancient world, that's religion. That's doing acts of piety, of goodwill, good nature, acts of devotion, or like if you were to do a particular offering, like if you were to take a sacrifice to a temple, let's say, that would be doing religion. But that's the way it was used. It's in regard to particular acts. It wasn't describing a whole section of thought and life and a paradigm and all of that. No. It was just, pious acts. And so with that, we'd have to ask, do we have, just like we've asked in the past, do we have any scriptural justification for identifying ourselves with the term Christianity? And no, we don't. We don't have a scriptural justification for being a religion called Christianity, and so we don't do that. But again, like I've said before, words mean only what they mean to the people. And so if someone is asking you, are you a Christian, and all they mean by that, and that all they mean by that is that you consider yourself a follower of Jesus, or you follow Jesus, or you believe that Jesus is the Messiah, then you can say, yes, I believe Jesus is the Messiah. You might clarify and say, that doesn't mean that all the things associated with the word Christian apply to me. But if all you're asking is this, then yes, I do believe in Jesus. So I'm not trying to be a stickler for terminology or anything like that, but I'm trying to highlight these principles and really the principles underlying our own self-identity and how we view the categories that people use today in dividing the world. And so it's a fair question to ask. Do we have scriptural justification for considering ourselves a religion or part of a religion? Is there even a concept of a religion that's anything like the concept of religion that we have today present in ancient Hebrew scripture or in New Testament or whatever? And is it a concept that's helpful? And what we found is that really the concept that people have today of religion is not helpful in identifying who we are and what we are about. And so for that reason, it's probably not the best way to describe ourselves. That said, there are, like I mentioned, elements of what we are about. People would not identify it as anything but religion, at least upon first hearing. So I don't think we should deny the term or separate ourselves from it or something like that and say, no, we're not religious and all of that, because people might say, well, hey, you keep the Sabbath. That's religious. We're not going to say no to that, like, sure, that's fine. So long as you understand that, the other things that you might attach to the word religious or religion are not what we are about. And like I said, like, if depending on how deep you go with it, really, if you just keep as, like, if we accept the word God and people say that the word God means religion, then we're religious. But if you say, well, the word God in English does not accurately convey what we believe in terms of the Elohim of the Hebrew Scriptures, and we're talking about beings that are more akin to what people would think of as extraterrestrials, well, then at that point people might say, no, you're not religious. So,
as I'm listening to this, and I don't know, how everybody else is hearing it, it seems to me as if our heavenly family is, if we do end up defining ourselves in the way you're describing, to me, my mind is going towards the fact that, wow, is this transitioning us so that we are in a better position to receive a broader audience? Is that now where we are, kind of thing? That's how I see where it would go if we're going to go in this direction.
Well, I would say for sure that is an inevitable impact of a transition such as that. But it goes both ways in a sense, because yes, it goes to a broader audience, but at the same time, because there is among religious people a secular religious divide where often secular is bad and religious is good, it may turn some people off. But again, we have to explain, like, well, look, it's not that this is against, let's say, the Scriptures or whatever. But I'll say that even that aspect of turning someone off is not actually a hindrance at all, because just as much if we approach it with those same people as, hey, we are a religion and this is our perspective on it, and yes, it's the branch religion, there's going to be just as much bias identifying ourselves as religion as if we did not, from those who would be opposed to us not identifying ourselves as religious.
Absolutely.
So it really would not be a hindrance at all, even though some would be turned off by the fact that we wouldn't primarily describe ourselves using terms like religion. So for that reason, there's not really reason, and I honestly cannot think of a reason right now I'll put it like this. I can't think of a reason to primarily identify ourselves in terms of religion. And because of that, I can't see a reason why we shouldn't immediately make that transition, because of the fact that we ought to do all things based on evidence. And if we have no evidence for primarily identifying ourselves in terms of religion, why do it? Just like, I've mentioned before, our default should not be, oh, our current position is this, and therefore we'll go with our current position until evidence shows contrary. No, our default should be, I don't know until we know. And so until we know that is the best way to do things and that's the helpful way to do things, then let's not do things like that. Let's explain ourselves in terms of the reality in the most straightforward way of who we are and what we are about. And if terms like religion are actually contrary, or if terms like religion are understood in such a way that adds more confusion than it does add insight, then why do that when we're about insight? We're about illuminating and helping, not adding confusion. And so, but I hope, though, I really do hope that as you all are listening to and participating in this conversation, that you are paying careful attention to the nuances of what is being said. Because, to repeat, I am not saying to deny words like religious and all of that. I'm saying to be very attentive to the individuals with whom you speak and allow their definition of terms to be okay. Like, in other words, if someone says, I define religion like this, and their definition of religion describes who we are and what we're about, then say, yeah, sure, under that definition, totally, we are absolutely religious. But the fact that most people do not define religion in terms that we can properly identify with means that we shouldn't really use it as our primary thing, like, hey, this is what we're about, because it just leads to misunderstanding. So, again, keep those sorts of nuances in mind, please, because I know this is a subject where I could be greatly misunderstood. So any other comments or questions about all this?
The Shekinah is on the move.
I have to say, good comment. Yeah, absolutely, yes. Okay, there is one other thing that I'll say, and it's really just continuing on what you said, Anna, about the impact in a broader audience and so on. Here's the thing. We are to be a peculiar people. And if you guys haven't noticed, that's kind of happening. We're kind of becoming more and more peculiar in a sense. And the terms that we use make a big difference as to the initial impression that we leave upon the minds of others. And as everyone knows, initial impressions make a big difference. And I do not yet know the way in which we will come to the forefront in the world scene, as it were. But I know that the way in which it happens is going to make a big difference as to how we are received and the impact we have. And we need to be okay with being a peculiar people. We need to be okay with being very different from every religious system out there. You know, like we've talked about before, terms like spirit and spiritual give an idea in people's minds which is so contrary to what we are about. Even words like prayer. I'm not opposed to the word in and of itself. I'm not opposed to what we talk about as prayer. But when people in the rest of the world think of prayer, they're thinking of a supposed telepathic experience or a meditative experience, understanding meditation not as deep thought, but as an absence of deep thought, actually. So it's the exact opposite of what we try to convey. You know, if people talk about, you know, your prayer life and, you know, prayer and all of that, they're talking about an experience that we oppose. But we don't oppose what the scriptures talk about when they talk about calling out to Yahweh. So it's a very, we have to be careful with the way we express things and to whom we express them, because we don't want to cause misunderstandings in either direction. We don't want to come across as spiritualistic. And in fact, we need to separate ourselves from anything spiritualistic or apparently spiritualistic. But we also need to make sure that we, people who are religious are basically spiritualistic. And when we separate ourselves from spiritualism to those people, it could so easily come across as separating ourselves from, the Bible. And even when I say the Bible, again, like, we separate ourselves from the idea of the Bible, but we don't separate ourselves from the content of the writings which have been compiled into the Bible. And so we have to draw our distinctions, and we have to be careful not to come across as anti-Isaiah, anti-Paul, and absolutely, God forbid, anti-Jesus. We need to be the most pro-Jesus, pro-branch people out there. We need to be the most pro-Jesus, pro-branch people out there in the world. And that needs to be a huge thing. We need to be the most truth, pro-principle, pro-love, pro-morality people out there in the world. Pro-evidence, pro-all of that, all of the things that we really talk about in the message. And it needs to be clear that we are pro all of that. And so there needs to be no excuse for people who would think that we are anti-Jesus, anti-Scripture, anti-any of those things. We need to make it obvious that we are in favor of those things, but that we are not in favor of the things that we really are not in favor of. So I just wanted to emphasize that point in order to hopefully heighten our sense of the need to really try and help people and not turn them away from the message in any regard.
Mm-hmm. Personally, I think it makes logic sense, and I think I like it.
Okay, cool. I actually sincerely appreciate that response. I really do. Does anyone else want to express their response to this? Well, that's an interesting response.
Is everybody just in shock, or?
Time
Hello?
to get unmuted.
I think it's a good topic, and it is something, to be honest, where I've questioned what I should say to different people in different situations. So I think it's something we definitely need to be thinking about and talking about. So I think it's positive to have this discussion, and I also like the fact that we're still not 100% sure how to say it. I think it's still evolving a little bit, and probably needs to be as we figure out the direction that the Heavenly Family is taking us. But no, I think it's definitely something we need to be thinking about, because the more you're in the world, the more this topic comes up. So. And, myself anyway, I work in this world, all my customers and vendors and, just the people you run into on a day-to-day basis, it's something that definitely comes up.
Absolutely. I like that you like that we're not totally settled on how to go through it yet, because that's part of the beauty of this, the process of progress and coming to understand and to express and all of that. So yeah.
If we had, I can easily see it being that if we had a rote way of expressing it, it would just become another
Stigma, category.
Well, yes, but what's the thing where I must be tired? They have a list of their beliefs.
Oh, another dogma?
Creed.
Oh, another creed.
Yes.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important that it evolve because, it's going to be experiential. I mean, we're going to see the effects that it has on different people. And, the way that we present this will have an effect on people coming into the message and possibly even leaving the message. So, I think we need to think of it kind of as a living, breathing entity, as we figure out and, just as we experience what happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and not everyone's going to understand the same phraseology anyway. We just have to know what we know why we believe the things we believe, and once we really, and a few different ways of expressing that, possibly. But, just knowing our audience, knowing how to listen to people and getting to know what they understand, then we'll be able to explain better who we are and what our approach is.
And keep in mind, too, that all of this is part of our seeking to accommodate the understanding of people. It's our seeking to accommodate their desire to categorize us, even though we defy category in the categories that they have. But I will say that really the best way for us to define ourselves and the way that heaven has given us is branch.
Yeah.
Branches, that's actually the best way to define ourselves. Now, of course, this is slightly different from what we've been talking about so far. Like, what we've been talking about still needs to be there, and we still have to define, because people will want to know, do you guys consider yourselves a religion? Do you consider yourselves this and that? So this doesn't negate any of that. But I will say that it's a very useful way to describe ourselves, because it's direct, it's to the point. And one of the things that I often explain to people when I say, yes, we're branches, what do you consider yourselves? We're branches. Well, what does that mean? Well, the whole idea of a branch or a sprout is that it's growing and it's alive and it's changing and it's adapting, and that's what we are into. We're into progress and growth and producing fruits, So high production, change, progress, life, all of those things. And so the word branch really does capture the fundamental principles of what we are about, and so it can be helpful. So I wanted to mention that because it may come in useful when talking to people.
And I might add to that, I think it'd be proper to say, and then as the branch matures, it becomes more and more into the likeness of the parent, the full parent plant, because you can take a branch and planting it become, not on all plants, but it has a resemblance to the rest. It resembles the rest of the tree. I don't think I'm saying that very well, but so
it grows up to look the same as the plant from which it was taken.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to say. But then I thought, well, wait a minute. No, the branch is on the tree. But
the branch is referring to a grapevine anyway, not a tree.
Yeah. Okay. That's right. That's
well.
That's where I was off. That's where I was off.
Well, I'll just say though that's in some context. But for instance, the branch in Isaiah 11 is talking about cutting down the Assyrian forest, and there's this tree stump there, and you have the rod and the branch.
That's right.
So it's different images slightly in different places, and some of the words are better translated branch, some of it maybe sprout.
So we have to describe ourselves differently?
Yes, we have to describe ourselves differently.
In different situations?
Yeah.
Interesting. There's a type for that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Anyway, I think Leroy had a comment. Is that right?
The thought that came to mind was that we're going to be growing throughout eternity. When you quit growing and learning, you're going the opposite way. So God is learning constantly. We come to the conclusion the other day in our study. So we're going to be, I love learning. That's the joy of life, is learning new witty inventions from Sister Wisdom. And that's the beauty of life, learning. And we're going to be doing it forever.
Amen. Wonderful. And I think that that's a good note to end on as well. Everlasting progress and learning.
Amen.
So that said, to avoid the word prayer, would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family for our discussion tonight?
I will.
Awesome.
Heavenly Family, thank you for guiding us. Thank you for blessing us with advancing in our understanding and for agitating our minds upon these subjects so that we can advance further and further. And please continue to guide us. Help us to understand principles of truth. Help us to understand the way things really are in this world. And help us to learn more about who you guys are and what you want out of us, what you want from us, and how we can best serve you and how we can best serve one another. And help us to be real with one another and to really draw close to one another, and help us to get this work done, Heavenly Family. Please raise up laborers to take up the work of this message. Thank you. We ask this in the name of Branch. Amen.
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 All right. Love you all. Lila Tov.
Lila Tov.
Lila Tov.